My name is Scott Hansen. I work in the Historic Preservation Program in the Planning Department for the City of Portland. We're going to be taking a look back at Franklin Street. Franklin Street originally was simply a city street that ran from the waterfront to the area close to Back Cove. Eventually it ran from Commercial Street once Commercial Street was created. We're going to be taking a look at Franklin Street in 1924. These are from the tax assessor's photos. This is down at the block between Commercial Street and 4th Street. One of the few buildings still existing on Franklin, or Franklin Arterial as it is called today. Moving up the hill, we see a mix of residential and commercial buildings, more small-scale commercial with residential above. There was a number of bakeries along the street. Greek Revival, Second Empire style houses, very typical of Portland from the early and mid-19th century. We're moving up the hill toward Newbury Street. Largely residential, something that would be hard to imagine today. Here we're on the block between Congress and Cumberland. We get a glimpse of the cathedral spire in the upper right-hand corner. The building on the right that we just see the bay window of is the other building that still exists on Franklin Street. It's a brick apartment house. Here it's on the right, and we're looking at a little house that sat in behind it. The cathedral is in the background. You can see it on the top left. Moving down beyond Cumberland Avenue, wooden residential houses, typical 19th century Portland architecture. Large elm trees line the street, as they did most of the streets in Portland. A nice house at the corner of Oxford Street. A stick-style house, an architectural style that Portland had very few of and today has even fewer of. This is looking back up the hill on Franklin as we move down toward Back Cove. Again, looking down from the same location at the other side of the street. And now we're getting down to the bottom of the hill as the land flattens out, and this is all fill. This was originally part of Back Cove, and we see a number of very simple vernacular Greek Revival, story-and-a-half, modest homes. These are the type of homes that Bayside was filled with before it was cleared in urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s. So where today we see scrap yards and parking garages and storage warehouse and Whole Foods, there were block after block of these simple little single-family homes. And here we're getting right to the end. We see Back Cove in the distance. In 1924, Back Cove extended much further into the peninsula than it does today. The creation of Interstate 295 involved considerable filling. On the right, sticking out from the phone pole, it appears, we see a little triangle, and that is the railroad crossing sign where the new Bayside Trail will be crossing Franklin Arterial. On the right side of Franklin, at the corner of Fox Street, we see the last substantial house on Franklin at number 229. This is where the buses park today. In the 1940s and 50s, traffic became a big news story in Portland, and slums became a big news story in Portland. These two things together eventually led to the creation of the Franklin Arterial, which cleared many, many historic houses and neighborhoods and created the divided highway across the peninsula connecting Interstate 295 to Commercial Street. This was big news for several decades as the war was waged to clear the slums and build the roads. Both of them were actively opposed by Portland residents and actively supported by other Portland residents. The first slum clearance project that was finally approved was the Deervine and Chatham Street project, 1954 through 56. This was a small area that was flanked on the east by India Street, the south by Commercial, the west by Pearl, and the north by Middle. All of the buildings in this area were demolished with the exception of what had been the first chewing gum factory in America. It still stands. It's the Hub Furniture building. Everything else in those blocks was demolished. Following this period of demolition came the concept for Franklin Arterial. And if we look at this map, we see in red the original Franklin Street, and then in blue the right-of-way that was cleared for the creation of the Franklin Arterial. In addition to Franklin Street, there were a number of buildings at the cross-street intersections that were eliminated. And here we're at 4th Street looking toward the Custom House. All of these buildings on the left disappeared. And on the opposite side of 4th Street, this whole area also disappeared, including the small street on the left, which we will get to shortly. This building still stands at the corner of Middle and Franklin Arterial, but all of these others disappeared for the right-of-way for Franklin Arterial. What you see here on Middle Street particularly is that the commercial connection from India Street through the Old Port right up to Congress Street at that time was a really important commercial corridor. Middle Street extended to Monument Square through what is now the pedestrian area beside One City Center. India Street had been the city's original commercial center. It moved westward to Exchange Street in the 19th century, and by the early 20th century moved beyond to Congress Street. Middle Street was the connection that tied those city centers together through the centuries, really. At Newbury Street, we had a residential street, and these are buildings that were lost at that time. These, of course, today would be Victorian residential buildings immediately abutting the Old Port. Federal Street, these buildings looked out on Lincoln Park. We see the fence for Lincoln Park in the foreground. About a quarter of Lincoln Park was lost for the Franklin Street Arterial. At Congress Street, we see this wooden commercial building with residences above. The cathedral spire is in the background. Here is the northeast corner of Franklin and Congress. The little square building behind the writing, 320 Congress, is the little building that still exists there that was the lock shop for many years. The Boston Supply Company building and all those buildings going down Franklin are gone. This was on Congress. It today would be between the two lanes of Franklin as you're walking east or west on Congress. And other buildings that faced onto Lincoln Park that disappeared. Moving down to the corner of Cumberland and Franklin, this building was eliminated along with all of these. This remarkable row of brick row houses faced onto Cumberland Avenue between Franklin and Wilmot. Franklin Towers sits here today, as well as a portion of the right-of-way for Franklin Arterial. A very early house down at the corner of Oxford. This is probably from the 1830s. and more buildings at Oxford Street. Oxford was largely residential with a little commercial mixed in, what would be considered a great example of mixed-use development today. And again, on Oxford, just nice residential buildings. At this time, Oxford Street was a very important east-west connection before the creation of at first Route 1 around Back Cove and then Interstate 295. Oxford Street would have been the primary way to get through Portland if you were traveling from north to south or east to west through the city. You would come in on Portland Street, now Park Avenue, and continue west on Oxford all the way to Washington Street, or Washington Avenue as it became, and that would take you out over Tukey's Bridge, 2 points up the coast or going inland towards Lewiston. This is a wonderful little half house. The double house is a very unique Portland building type. It runs from the Federal era right up through all of the Victorian styles and into the early 20th century. It is not nearly as common elsewhere as it is in Portland. Double houses were built not only in all styles, but at all income brackets, from very modest ones like this simple Greek Revival wooden one, to mansions on the West End that were built to house two families side by side. What makes this one truly exceptional is it's half a double house, and I don't know of any like it that exists today in the city. Here we're at the corner of Lancaster and Franklin, looking down Lancaster. Again, buildings that were all demolished for the creation of Franklin Arterial. This is approximately where the Noise Warehouse building is today. In addition to what we've seen, there were several short streets that ran parallel to Franklin that disappeared entirely. And Chatham is the first one we will look at. It ran between 4th Street and Middle Street, parallel to Franklin. Very narrow street, looks a little grim, but we see the fur coat-clad lady who appears to be quite comfortable. These were some of the earliest streets in the city, very, very small scale, and they disappeared. Fremont Place ran between Newbury and Federal, a single block long, and had this one house that faced onto it. Quincy Street was a very, very narrow street. It ran between Congress and Cumberland Avenue, approximately where the row of pine trees is today that defines the western edge of Franklin Arterial on that block. And it was just lined with these really remarkable early houses. Some of them appear to be pre-fire, so it's a block that probably survived the Great Fire of 1866 that wiped out much of what was around it. Lincoln Place was another little street that ran off Oxford. It didn't go all the way through the block, and had several houses on it. So we end with a comparison of Franklin Street and Franklin Arterial, showing what was and what is today.